Hi, everybody. Welcome to the second in our series of educational seminars on tree growing practices, nursery tree growing practices. Tonight we're going to be focusing on planting of tree whip selection, and other related topics. And we are again joined by Dan Ziomek, who will be leading this discussion.
Thank you, Mary. I wanted to start out tonight just backtracking to last week and see if anybody came up with any more questions on last week before we move on to whip selection and that kind of thing. Anybody got any questions they came up with? No? All right. We'll just dive right into whip selection. So when you're planting your nursery, you're primarily using whips. And the first thing I want to talk about is just species selection. You're looking mostly at natives, but keep in mind that planting a variety of trees is best in today's environment. The trees that are not necessarily native might grow better in some of the soil conditions or planting sites that you have. It's somewhat dependent on what nurseries have available, as Mary is finding out. You can't always get what you want from the nurseries. Take, for instance, American beech. It's a great native tree, but very few nurseries grow it because it's extremely slow growing. It's not cost effective for them to grow American beech. So it's hard to find that plant when you go looking at some of these lists that the nurseries make available. Native trees, like I said, may not be the best for all the sites that you have. If you have clay soil, maybe a red maple, which is native, or some other species is going to be better in a clay site than some other native trees. And then, think about what species are going to grow best in your nursery in terms of ease of maintenance and speed of growth. It's much easier to grow a red maple to a plantable size than, say, a red oak. They just grow that much faster. And again, I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm here to just guide you, I guess. But species I would recommend growing versus purchasing them already established. So if I were to choose, I would pick things like red maple, river birch, honey locust, sweet gum, tulip trees, tilia, basswood, American elms, and serviceberry to grow in the nursery, because those are relatively easy to grow. They'll get up to a size you can plant out in a short amount of time and just be more cost effective for you in the nursery, versus those ones that I think maybe would make more sense to purchase already grown for you. And that would be things like sugar maple, black gum, oaks of all types, hornbeam, hop hornbeam, and beech. These are much slower growing, are going to take 5 to 7 years to get to a plantable size in the nursery, again, depending on what size whip you buy, and just are going to be less cost effective for you to plant in the nursery. You could use dollars that you already have from the tree committee to purchase trees already established. Maybe save out a portion of the budget to buy a few trees from Sugarloaf or somewhere else that are more established, and you won't have to wait so long for them to be plantable. Any questions there before I turn the page?
Will you give us this list and print it?
Oh. Sure.
Yeah. Great.
And I'm pretty new to this subject and terminology. And when you say whip, what are like the dimensions of the whip?
Well, I'm going to go into that on the next page.
Okay.
I've got some of that terminology written down here, and Mary and I went back and forth via email because she came up with one I've never seen before. So we'll talk about that when I turn the page here.
Sounds good.
I've got a question about beech. So given the struggles that beech has in our forest, is it still a viable street tree? Is it a viable street tree at all?
Well, now with this beech leaf disease, probably not. It's just one that I know is a problem purchasing from anywhere across the country. Finding American beech is very difficult. You can find European beech, but they too are susceptible to this new beech leaf disease. Otherwise, beeches aren't generally a street tree because they need, lots of organic matter around their root system. They don't like compacted soil at all, so they're not necessarily a good street tree per se.
And what about sweet gum? So we had one failed attempt at sweet gum, but I think we're now well within the, hardiness range for sweet gum. Can you give us any tips on why, what is a successful way to grow those if they need something in particular?
They don't need anything in particular, and they actually are a good one for compacted, damp soils. They should grow just fine, and again, with our changing climate, they should be even better. Some of the hybrids are hardier than some of the species types, so you might look into those. But we have been selling sweet gums since we opened in Sunderland, and I used to sell them at Hadley as well, and they always did just fine. 2 years ago, I brought in 18 for the new president's inauguration at Amherst College. They planted all those out. I did notice that 2 out of 3 that I drive by, the tops died back on them, but they seem to be re-leadering themselves now.
And in terms of small trees, I noticed you just mentioned Amelanchier, but are there others that we would be successful in growing in the nursery? Because unfortunately, we could just hold the line and say we're only going to plant shade trees, but there are so many people who want trees but have utility lines over their tree belts. So, we've typically been planting hornbeam, hop hornbeam, redbud, crab apples, and other smaller stature trees.
Well, unfortunately, when it comes to natives, there aren't a lot of choices in flowering trees or smaller statured trees. There are some small maples. Acer campestre, I believe, is okay, hedge maple. That one would be fine. Not very showy, but it would survive and be underneath the power lines. Crab apples are possibly a choice. There are some more upright growing crab apples, not native, but would work. If you're going to plant dogwoods, I would definitely lean into Coosa dogwoods versus native dogwoods. They're having a lot of problems right now. Hawthorns are a possibility. Again, not native, but would do the job of giving people a flowering tree. And there are lots of hawthorns that don't have the big 1-inch thorns on them nowadays. Thornless, more or less. So flowering tree options to plant in the tree belt are fewer when it comes to natives, but there are selections out there.
What about the horse chestnut? That's the smaller stature horse chestnut.
It's a possibility. They do get leaf blotch and a few other things. I was just thinking fringe tree would be another native that could work. You've just got to find it single stem. It wants to become a multi-stem tree even when they train it into a single stem. So that's something to take into consideration when you're looking at your planting sites. But the horse chestnut is a good tree. We sell the pink flowering horse chestnut. It can get to be 35, 40 feet tall, so it may not work under wires. Anybody else? Sure.
I lost a redbud recently at my house. Are there any issues coming in for that species?
Actually, no. Redbuds are exploding on the market right now. There are so many new redbuds coming out, it's hard to keep up with. Not to my knowledge are there any problems. They can get canker very easily when they're stressed. So that means when they're under drought conditions or too wet, they can get canker in their trunks very easily, and that can affect them. But otherwise, there aren't many insects or diseases that bother redbuds, and I think that's why they're exploding on the market. The other factor is our climate change. We can grow them now here more easily. Winter has always been a problem on redbuds in that if we have a warm fall, which we seem to be having more and more of, and then the temperatures drop rapidly down to, say, 10 degrees, redbuds aren't able to adapt to that rapid drop in temperature, and they can get freeze damage. But I think most nurseries are moving to red buds to replace flowering dogwoods, because flowering dogwoods have got a leaf disease down in Tennessee and North Carolina, where most of those come from. It's moving northward, unfortunately, and even some of the liner growers out in Oregon and Washington are running into this leaf disease. So it may be that flowering dogwoods become very difficult to find in the next 5 to 7 years until they come up with either a spray for this disease or some kind of resistant variety.
Any thoughts on yellowwood or Carolina silverbells?
I love yellowwoods. We've got lots of them down in Sunderland because nobody loves them as much as I do, unfortunately. Carolina silverbell is a great tree, but it too can be susceptible to canker when it's put into stress conditions, so it doesn't make it a great street tree, because we all know street tree planting is stressful on most of what we plant. But yellowwoods would be a great choice. Fragrant white flowers in late spring, early summer. The wood is yellow, actually. That's where they get the name from. They have a compound leaf, so it's less cleanup for the town or whoever. So I would highly recommend yellowwoods.
Do we have any now?
We are not growing any yellowwood currently, but we did plant some when we had the grant. We planted quite a few yellowwoods in the
That we bought
community.
from
Yep.
somewhere else?
Yep. And then what about we had some pretty bad experience with flowering cherry. So Kwanzaa, for instance, around town, the bark just split wide open on them.
Yeah, that's a problem for all cherries. They're a very thin bark tree. I would recommend the first couple winters after you plant them to protect the bark somehow with white collars to reflect the sunlight. Once they are established, that's less of a problem. But again, if you get the right fall where it's warm and the bark doesn't harden off the way it should, and then the temperature drops rapidly, we all know when things freeze, they expand, and that's exactly what happens in the trunk of a cherry. The cells freeze, they expand, and the bark goes pop, and then you end up with that big frost crack. It's a good tree, but it has its share of problems. Japanese beetles can be a problem. There are a few fungus issues as well. So it's a nice tree, but I don't know that it's a great street tree.
Okay, one other, just a related one is the American linden. We saw similar issues with the bark splitting wide open on that. Again, another thin barked tree. Is that what's going on there?
100%. You can almost see it on the linden how thin the bark is. Again, I would plan on wrapping those for the first couple winters with white wrapping. They make those available. I'm sure you could come up with something. You could even use like white PVC pipe, and just cut a notch out to fit it around the trunk. Something to reflect the sunlight away from the bark of the tree.
Yeah, so I've been talking to Mary and the committee about hornbeams, American hornbeams on my street strip. And I've had actually success with them in Oregon and planting them, and they did grow slow, but they actually came up. What are the advantages and disadvantages to hornbeams? I love them. I mean, I think they're not too tall. They don't take up too much sunlight coming in. Yeah, just wondering your opinion on the advantages and disadvantages.
Carpinus.
Oh, yeah.
Carpinus caroliniana. Right. Yeah. So Carpinus caroliniana is a great tree. They are doing lots of hybridizing of it now. The hard part is finding it because it does grow slower. Again, like oaks, it's not as readily available from nurseries. I know Bailey's has got some on the list that Mary was looking at, so it's possible you could find some there. But it would make a great street tree. It doesn't get too large. It's got a small leaf, so leaf cleanup is easy. I would highly recommend that. The problem is, again, I just talked about that, it grows very slowly. So in the nursery, it may not be cost effective. It's going to take you 5 to 7 years to grow a whip up to a size that you can plant out.
Actually, there's a couple good examples in the Davis Street parking lot where the skate park is. There's a couple of them that have done really well in what are like the most extreme conditions in the middle of a parking lot, full beating down sun, and then lots of salt in the wintertime, and they're doing great. So it's good to see that.
Anybody else? So when it comes to whip selection, there's a couple things you want to be looking for. First is function. What's the intended use of the tree we're picking from the nursery's list? Do we want it for shade? Do we want it to flower? How will it grow in its intended location? So function should probably be the number one choice when you're looking at a list of trees that are possible choices for you to plant out in the nursery. Size, what's the intended size of the plant you want to plant? You almost have to be thinking ahead 3 to 5 years down the road of your planting sites and where these trees might go. It's hard to do that because you don't know what's going to live or die on the street, what the town's going to take down, what a car is going to drive into. There are all sorts of factors that come into the sites you may be planting. But thinking in terms of how big you want things to get when you're purchasing them is something to take into account. The health of the tree or the species that you're choosing. Is it pest free? As we just talked about with some of these different trees that Mary was asking about, there are issues with cherries that makes them not a great street tree choice. So that's probably one I kind of skip over when I'm looking at a list of trees and say, no, we're going to stay away from that because it's just going to cause problems for us down the road. Or it's going to be a short-lived tree. We're going to spend all this time and effort growing it up to a size where we can plant it, and then it's going to be gone in 3 to 5 years after we plant it. So that's something to take into account when you're purchasing before you even start growing them in the nursery. And then soil conditions. What are your planting sites primarily like? Are they sand? Are they clay? If you have a lot of clay sites, then you want to look to plants like red maples that can take those soil conditions. Versus sandy sites, which are better for oaks and that kind of thing. So again, what are most of your sites looking like as you plant out even now? Are they heavy clay or are they heavy sand? That kind of thing. And then of course price. Whips are not cheap, so you've got to pick a size, and we're going to talk about sizes here in a second. That fit the budget of the tree committee and what you can afford for each year's budget. And that will depend on the size of the plant you buy. As far as terminology, when it comes to buying these things, whips are graded by the nursery after they harvest them. So they go through with this huge machine. It's essentially a bulldozer up on stilts that goes over the top of the row with a U-blade underneath and lifts these trees out of the ground, and then there's a crew coming behind that picks these lifted trees up and puts them on a wagon. They're taken to a cold storage and stored in the cold storage. They're usually not bundled until after they're graded, so these are all loose at this time. And then the grading process happens throughout the fall and winter. That's when they pick out the different sizes according to their grading. And the size of the whip at harvest determines the cost. So when you're looking at a list, as Mary's been doing, and I don't know if you all are privy to the list that Mary sees, but you look down the list and you see WH 5 foot. That means a whip. A whip is a tree, but it has no branches. It looks like my thumb, but it's 5 feet tall. So that's a very young tree. Maybe it's been in their growing facility for a year or two. That's all. And then they harvest them and sell them at that size. And those are the most cost-effective trees to purchase. When you get into a 1 year, 4 foot, you're talking about an older tree that maybe has some small branches starting. A 1 year LB, 6 foot, means 1 year old with light branching. It's going to cost you more money because it does have some branching already. In this case, I looked one up that was 6 foot tall. So again, if it's a taller tree, it's going to cost you a little more money as well. TT, 1 inch, that means it's been transplanted 2 times. So it's been planted originally, then it's been dug up and replanted. You're going to get a tree with a better fibrous root system. It's going to usually have a heavier caliper because it's gone into the nursery a second time, but it's going to be more expensive because it has been at the nursery that much longer. CL stands for clump. You're going to see that on birches and other plants that are known for clumping. And that's the only time you'll see that. And then the one that Mary and I came across was a BGR. And B means B grade. That means it has a defect. In this case, it's the root system. BGR stands for roots. It means it's going to have a one-sided root system or some other problem with the root system. Now, they do discount these plants by 25%, at least at Bailey's Nursery, but you're going to have some kind of defect in the root system. And then they have a BGRT, which means the top has a defect. It might be missing a branch. Maybe a branch got broken when they were harvesting. Something has caused a defect in the top of the tree, in their estimation, to where they have to discount the plant. Any questions on that? That's a lot of terminology.
Yeah, so I just will say that Richard and John and I are looking at the Bailey's list right now. Bailey's Nursery, they're growers in, I know them from being in Minnesota, but they're also in Oregon and I think other places as well. So we're looking at whether or not we can put together a large enough order to meet their minimum. We can probably do that because we're getting the whips paid for again this year by a different grant. So we've been looking through there. One thing I thought I noticed, though, is most of the trees in this big, long, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of rows of trees in the spreadsheet, many of them are accompanied by a link to a photo of the tree, which is great. So you can get a sense of what the branching looks like on the trees. And I thought quite a few of the whips actually had branching.
Yeah, it depends on the species, of
Okay.
course. Some whips will have some small branches started, but generally when you're buying a whip, it means it has no branches yet. Mm-hmm. They do have photos on a lot of them. I noticed when I looked through the list, a lot of the whips don't have photos. They tend to take photos of the light branched or twice transplanted trees more so than the whips. But Bailey's has a place out on Sauve Island that I toured many years ago. They grew 3.5 million trees on 300 acres. So they're planted about a foot apart. It's just amazing to see, just row upon row of trees. And that's how all the whip grower, liner growers grow their plants out in Oregon, that close together, because they know they're only going to be there for a short amount of time. It was just amazing to see. And the grafting is done on these little carts that they roll along the ground on their bellies on, and they have a grafting knife and the scion wood right there, and they're amazing how fast they can do a graft. It's really a lost art that a lot of nurseries aren't doing any longer.
So technically, define a sapling from a whip.
I would say it's one and the same pretty much. I mean, a sapling to me is going to have some branching to it versus a whip, which, again, I look at as not having any branching yet. That comes with age. But they're one and the same, essentially.
So there's a seedling.
Seedlings are totally different. A seedling is just sprouted, and again, you would have to go to a different nursery than Bailey's to find seedlings. Seedlings are going to be graded differently. They're going to be graded in inches. You know, you can get an 18-inch seedling or a 24-inch seedling, but you're not going to get a 4-foot seedling unless it's something like a willow or something extremely fast-growing.
So seedlings are like 0 to 1.5 years or something, and then whips are...
Well, no. It's a totally different growing operation. Seedlings are grown from seed. They're sprouted, And generally, a nursery is not going to sell those until they're at least 12 inches. 6 to 12 inches is about the smallest you can buy. Very inexpensive, but more time in your nursery to grow them up to a plantable size. So I wouldn't recommend them for what you're doing. You don't have much space. Time is of the essence. You want to get these out into the ground as fast as you can, because the longer they spend in your nursery, the more inputs you have to put into them. Fertilizer, water, weeding, all of those things are going to take longer with a small plant versus a slightly larger plant. Sorry, Richard.
All of those inputs and our time, which,
Right.
we have a hard time, getting out there as it is. So to think about having a tree be in the nursery for 6 or 7 years versus a couple years, it's a big commitment of time. Yeah.
And I just had a note here, whips are the most cost-effective size to purchase, but with things like oaks, it might make sense to spend a little more and buy something a little bigger, maybe a light branch tree instead of a whip, to cut down on the amount of time it spends in the nursery, so you don't have to do as much fertilizing and maintenance on the oak tree as you would if you bought a whip. So just something to consider. And again, it all depends on what the budget will allow. I think a good goal to have would be 3 to 4 years in the nursery max, to try and turn them over that fast. Any longer than that, it's going to get less and less cost effective for you to have them in the nursery.
One thing that just sprung to mind, I know that I think maybe Northampton, possibly Amherst, the tree planting groups there have gotten bare root to plant directly into the ground. Some are doing fall plantings of bare root. Do you have any thoughts about community groups like ours trying that as a way of skipping the nursery and getting the tree directly into the ground?
Well, I actually have a good source for those out in New York State. It's called Schichtel's Nursery. They are known for their bare root trees. I think they primarily do that in the springtime. Again, like Bailey's, they dig them in the fall, they take them into storage, they grade them, they do all the things. I think they actually even dip them in a moisture holding solution before they ship them. They are less expensive, let's say, than buying a balled and burlap tree. Still $100 or more per tree, but they are easy to handle. You would have to have a group ready to plant them when they ship them, because they can't sit out for too long. They would need to be stored somewhere where it's cool and dark until you could get them planted. But it is a good alternative. And even Bailey's, you could plant those bare root, depending on the size you bought, directly from the nursery when you got them in, rather than planting them out in the grow bags out at the nursery.
Do you know if there's any research on like the survival rate between planting bare root, planting containerized, and planting balled and burlapped?
Well, with the trees from Schichtel's out in New York, they're well established, 1.25 inch, 1.5 inch caliper trees. They come with a huge root system. I've seen pictures of them. Their survivability is great. When you talk about something from Bailey's, which is a much smaller tree, still with a good root system, you saw the pictures. They really put good roots on everything they grow. The big thing for you all is going to be having somebody available to go and water them on a regular basis. You can't just throw a water bag on them and think that's enough. Until they get established a little bit, it's going to be every other day going out there and watering them. Because they need to get some roots established. But planting things dormant, planting them very early in the season, as soon as you can get into the soil, gives you a great advantage over planting, let's say, in May or June when the temperatures are going up, diseases are more prevalent. All those things are going on later in the season. So there are definitely advantages to it. As far as spring versus fall, you would have to select your plants very carefully as far as fall planting, because there are a lot of trees like red maples and oaks that are fall planting hazards, red buds. You don't want to plant those in the fall. So those would definitely be spring planted if you did decide to go bear root direct into the soil.
Are London plane tree on that list too? And why are those a fall tree or a fall planting hazard? Those trees you named.
As far as I know, London plane tree is not on that list. They're on that list because they don't transplant well in the fall. They just don't have time to establish a root system, and then they either desiccate or something else happens to them when they're planted in the fall. It's just years of doing it that these trees have been put on the list because people have had trouble planting them in the fall. There aren't any specific research projects as to why they're on the list. It's just experience through the years that these plants are not recommended for fall planting. I think sweet gums are on that list.
I know London planes have been, cultivated for a long, long time through British history and then into American history. But is there a reason that like sycamores aren't used in cultivation or in these tree lines? I guess they're kind of big trees, but what's the reason for that?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head there in that the size of sycamores takes them out of the consideration for the tree belt by and large because they get so big. They get, the tree in Sunderland is 70 or 80 feet tall and 60 feet wide, and the trunk on it is, 7 feet in diameter. London planes fit into the urban landscape much better than sycamores do. The other thing is transplanting. Sycamores don't transplant very well. They have a taproot that makes them difficult to transplant. And just like beeches, they're not widely grown in nurseries because of those issues. The demand isn't there and the taproot issue, so you don't see them available from growers as much as you do London plane trees.
We did quite a few sycamores, didn't we?
No, we had some sycamores just for a special project down on the Green River, but not as a street tree.
Yeah, they like a heavy soil. You see sycamores growing along the Connecticut River. They're a floodplain tree. They like a high water table, heavier soils, that kind of thing. But it's really the size that takes them out of the running for street tree planting. Anybody else?
There's sort of a shortage of trees, of nursery stock right now because a lot of people want to plant trees. And I'm curious, you and Mary have already talked about a lot of the ones that we know about. Are there ones that are specializing in native species here? Are there ones that we maybe could explore as we are looking for stock?
Well, if you go online, you can find all kinds of nurseries growing native trees and plants. We have right over in South Hadley, New England wetland plants. That's all they grow is natives. They don't grow many trees, however. They're primarily shrubs and wildflowers and that kind of thing. But there are definitely a host of nurseries. I was looking at one down in New Jersey. I can't remember the name of it now, but again, if you go online and just Google native trees, you're going to come up with a whole list of nurseries. But even like Bailey's, which is a very large commercial nursery, they've got 3,000 acres in Minnesota and another 3,000 in Oregon. They grow a lot of native trees. I mean, they know the demand is there, and I'm seeing it from the nurseries that we deal with, more and more native plants coming online. Now, a lot of them nowadays are cultivars of natives. They call them native bars because of the whole patent thing now in the nursery business. Everybody wants to put a patent on a new plant so they can make money that way in addition to selling the plant. So you're seeing a lot of cultivars. Let's take something like the Carpinus caroliniana. There are a couple new hybrids that I've never heard of on Bailey's list, but I'm sure there's a patent on them because somebody selected them out, saw that it had great fall color or grew faster, who knows what, and they put a patent on it. So that means you have to pay a royalty on it. On a tree, it's usually $1 to $2 per plant in royalty fees for those. So there are nurseries growing just straight natives still. I deal with one down in Connecticut called Summer Hill Nursery. He refuses to grow patented plants. So he still grows a lot of native shrubs and some native trees, but it's a very limited list of trees. But by and large, all these nurseries are beholden to the patent holders, unfortunately.
Now, Dan, when you say native, I mean, different parts of the country have different, not maybe subspecies. I'm not sure. I mean, growing in Minnesota or Oregon are going to have different native, plants than, say, New England. When you say native, is this just the big picture native, or
I would say it's the big picture native. What grows in Minnesota, we all know it's colder in Minnesota. Their winters are way harder than ours. So the selection of plants they grow in Minnesota versus what they grow in Oregon is a lot different. Just because the weather is warmer, the growing season is longer in Oregon than it is in Minnesota. But when it comes to natives, if it is hardy for Massachusetts and it's native to the United States, it's still considered a native for us.
And would you have any recommendations or considerations on specific cultivars for, New England, Massachusetts? Or, I mean, something that is grown in Oregon, it might not be, work here.
Well, again, if you look at longitude and latitude, Oregon is on the same, I'll probably do this wrong, latitude as us. So pretty close. So they do get cold out there. A lot of these nurseries are in and around Mount Hood. They're not like right on the coast. So they do get some cold weather out there. You just, again, have to select things that are hardy for here. As far as specific cultivars, again, that's entirely up to you folks as to what you want to plant out around the town. A red maple that's grown in Oregon versus Minnesota versus here, they're still red maples. They still have the same hardiness. That doesn't change depending on where they're grown. Now, when it comes to buying from the South, the big thing there is, they warm up earlier than us. So you have to be careful when you bring them in. I was just talking to Richard about that. We have to get our fruit trees out of Virginia before they start to leaf out, and that can happen second or third week of February down there. So we need to get those out of there. But again, red maples that are grown in Tennessee or North Carolina are still red maples. They still have the same hardiness. They're still going to come up here and transplant just fine. And because the growing season is longer, they can grow trees up to a saleable size faster, which brings the price down. And the same is true of Oregon.
So I'm wondering, so cultivars, are they all or virtually all grafted and thus sort of genetically identical? Because one of my concerns about cultivars versus species is that you plant a whole city with a certain cultivars all genetically identical, and there's no natural variation in their susceptibility to future pathogens and stuff.
Well, not all cultivars are grafted, but a good portion of them are, especially when it comes to trees. Like my example of the Carpinus, that is not grafted. It's just a selected variety that somebody saw growing in a field of Carpinus and said, hey, that one's different. We should propagate that. And they take cuttings and they root it, and that's how they get it. But when you talk about red maples, if you buy a red sunset maple or an October glory red maple, which are very common varieties on the market right now, those are grafted trees, and they are supposed to be genetically the same. As far as, insect and pest resistance. Again, a lot of these breeders and grafters and that kind of thing, nurseries, are selecting these out because they are more pest resistant. So in the long run, you might be better off with a cultivar than you are with a species because they're more resistant. But it goes back to the beginning of my talk. Planting a variety of different species is the way to go nowadays. You don't want to plant the whole city of Greenfield in red maples. You want to alternate with 5, 7, 10 different species of trees as you're doing already, so that if a disease comes through, let's say anthracnose or verticillium wilt on sugar maples is a great example. When the American elm died off, most cities and towns went and planted sugar maples one after the other, just like the American elm had been planted. And then this disease called verticillium wilt comes in. It's a root-borne disease, soil-borne disease, and the roots of these trees were all touching each other. So when one sugar maple got verticillium wilt, it transferred to the next tree in the line, and then down the line and down the line. And you still see sugar maples dying today from verticillium wilt, quite often, actually. The salt they're using on the roads isn't helping sugar maples at all either, and climate change. So there are a lot of issues with sugar maples right now. Did that answer your question?
I have a question about cultivars versus straight species. I know that many sort of native plant proponents say that cultivars are not as good as straight species trees, and I'm just wondering if there's science to back that up, because when I have asked that question, I haven't been provided the science, so I'm not sure.
Well, I may not be a good one to ask that question because, I sell both natives and cultivars, but I feel like as long as it's in the proper species, let's say, go back to red maples again, a red sunset maple is going to be superior for fall color, growing characteristics, and probably disease and insect resistance to a species red maple. There are a lot of people who only will plant natives. We're getting a lot of people now asking for non-hybrid native plants, and I'm trying to keep them happy and find those plants for them. But in the long run, I think the cultivars are probably better because they have been bred for superior characteristics.
I think this is a really interesting conversation to be having, and one that I've been thinking about recently a lot. I've been watching these videos from master gardeners of West Virginia, I think, and from what I've heard, there become issues if, at least in supporting biodiversity, if the flowers are not the color of the straight species, or if the plant is a larval host and the leaves are a different color or turn a different color at a different time of the year than the straight species, then that totally throws off the insects that want to lay their eggs on the plant or whatnot. And so they just avoid the plants. But I think it's really interesting what you're saying about cultivars being more hardy, and there's never really any way to tell, but in the long run, maybe a better choice, because at least with the diversity of cultivars, there's less susceptibility to pathogens and pests and things.
Well, we're talking primarily about trees, but you bring up a good point. So I learned last year from my brother-in-law, ninebark. You all should be familiar with ninebarks. It's a native plant, because the hybridizers and breeders have changed the color of the leaves from green to red now, and that's the most popular type to sell on the market. The pollinators and larval hosts and that kind of thing are not using ninebarks anymore because of that change in the leaf color. Hydrangeas, paniculata hydrangeas, are another good place to look. They used to have fertile flowers and sterile flowers. Now they've bred the fertile flowers out of them to make bigger, huge flower heads that are really showy for our landscapes, but don't support any pollinators whatsoever. So there are definitely instances where that's an issue. I think it's less of an issue in shade and flowering trees. Anybody else? Whip planting. We kind of covered this last time, but I'll go back over it briefly. So root flare. We all probably know about the root flare. That's where the trunk starts to widen out as it goes into the soil. On non-grafted trees, we want to make sure that root flare is at soil level. We never want to bury the root flare. That ends up causing girdling roots and other problems for the tree. So it may, when you're planting into your grow bags, mean adding more soil for some trees to raise up the root flare, or taking away soil. Again, it all depends on what you're planting and where the root flare is. But it should be at soil level when you're all done planting. And you should compact the soil very well when you're planting, either using your fist or maybe a 2x4, or you can use water to compact the soil to make sure you're getting your final soil height when you're planting. Otherwise, you can get settling going on, and all of a sudden you're exposing more of the root system than you want. So compacting the soils at planting is really important. When it comes to grafted material, you'll see a little knob on, let's say, a red sunset maple. That's the graft union. That graft union should be 1 to 2 inches above soil level when you're all done planting. It kind of supersedes the flare where the graft is.
I didn't know that.
We don't want to bury that graft union. Otherwise, in some cases, we'll lose any dwarfing that we might have. If the scion roots in, it will become a full-size tree when we thought we were planting a dwarf. But otherwise, you can get some other undesirable traits coming from the scion wood rooting in. Suckering would be a big one that can happen if the graft is buried. And then you want to water immediately after you plant the trees to settle the soil and also to get some water back into the root system. I don't know if you do this when you're planting, but soaking the roots in a bucket of water before planting is always a good idea. It can be for as little as 5 minutes. It could be you could stick them in the bucket of water when you get there in the morning, get everything else ready, and then start planting. But making sure the root system is as full of water as possible is a real good idea. When it comes to pruning, as far as the top is concerned, you really don't want to do too much pruning when you're first planting. If there's broken branches or crossing branches, you can take those off when you're planting. It's more the root system we want to look at when we're planting. And oftentimes there are a lot of coarse roots on the root system that need to be cut back to fit into your grow bags. And that's fine. Try to avoid cutting the fine fibrous root system at all if possible, to prevent loss of those feeder roots and water uptake roots for that newly establishing tree. Any questions on planting?
Yeah, sorry, go over again about the root flare versus the graft. I thought mostly the root flare would be lower than the grafting site. So does that mean you bury the root graft? Sorry, bury the flare and leave the graft above it?
Generally speaking, the flare is going to start right below the graft. What you don't want to end up with is the graft being 6 or 8 inches out of the ground, so that you can get the flare where you want it to be. The graft should always be 1 to 2 inches above soil level. That's where it was done in the nursery. As you all probably know, you don't want to change the level that the tree was grown at very much. Again, 1 to 2 inches above soil level, and then again, the flare should happen just below the graft in most cases. Occasionally on fruit trees, you'll see it start a little lower, but again, we're not talking about fruit trees here. It's mostly shade and flowering trees, and in those cases, the flare starts right below the graft. Anybody else? We're going too fast here.
What's a scion?
The scion is what they use to graft onto the rootstock. So the scion is the desirable tree that they're putting on top of the rootstock. Now, in the case, I keep going back to red maples, the rootstock on a red maple is generally going to be a species red maple. And then they grow it for a certain amount of years, let's say a year or two. They cut off that species red maple to create a graft site for the bud of a red sunset maple to be placed on there, and that's the scion. It's generally just a bud. It is not a branch or anything in most cases when it comes to grafting out in Oregon, at least. Here on the East Coast, they do more tea budding and that kind of thing, and fruit trees are often tea budded as well, which means they cut off the rootstock. Again, let's say on an apple tree, it's some kind of dwarf rootstock. They'll cut that off. They'll create a T, so they'll slice the bark down and then make a T on the bottom of that so they can open it up. And then they put the scion of the desirable species, let's say McCowan, into that T area, and it's cambium to cambium. And that's where the attachment will happen, is in the cambium. It's really a lost art. There's fewer and fewer nurseries doing grafting anymore. Most of it is done with conifers and shade trees now, but there are still a few nurseries doing it with other species as well.
This is marginally related, but we bought a couple of black gum a few years ago, and they both had grafts up on the top of the tree, like grafted leaders. What's that about?
Well, that's unusual. You don't usually see them grafted up high like that. Now, you take, for instance, a tree hydrangea. That is often grafted up high. There are top-worked crab apples that are grafted at 4 feet or 6 foot. All of your weeping cherries pretty much are grafted at 4 or 6 foot. So they grow a sergeant cherry up to 4 or 6 feet. They cut it off, and then they put a bud of a weeping cherry on the top of that. Why a black gum would have that done, I don't know. That's very unusual to see that. They're generally grafted down low on cultivars such as wildfire that I've seen. All right, if nobody else has any questions, we'll move on to container options. And I know that the tree committee right now is using grow bags as their primary container after touring the nursery. There's really only 2 options out there. It's the grow bags or plastic containers. Grow bags are made of petroleum, which is a bad thing. There aren't really any good alternatives right now, but I'll talk about that at the end. They're easy to store. You can kind of compact them down flat. You can store them in your little shed out there without taking up a whole lot of room. And they can be reused to some extent. And we talked about that when we were out at the nursery. Certain species like to root through the grow bags and are hard to get the grow bags off. That's a problem, but grow bags, I don't know the cost. I haven't purchased any myself. They're probably $5 to $7 a piece on average, which is in the long run relatively inexpensive, but still there's a cost there. So as much reuse as you can do is going to be beneficial. With grow bags, you get better root development, and that's because of the air pruning effect of grow bags, the way you're using them. You're using them above ground, so when the root system hits the air outside of that grow bag, it stops growing. Roots can't grow in thin air, unfortunately. So they stop growing, and they put out more fibrous root system inside the grow bag, which is definitely a plus when it comes to grow bags. You get better drainage with grow bags, generally speaking. It's porous all the way around, so the water can weep out through all sides of the grow bag. that doesn't happen with plastic containers. The temperature is regulated better in grow bags than it is in a plastic container. And that's because of the fibrous nature of the grow bag, the fact that they're air pruning. There are lots of features that make the temperature better. And root zone temperatures are a big deal right now. There is a lot of research going on that. That same nursery in Connecticut, Summer Hill, he says that the root zone temperatures on his containers on a hot day can go up to 130 degrees. Roots don't want to grow in 130 degrees. So keeping the root zone cool is really important. And most of our containers nowadays are black in color or a dark color. That means they're attracting sunlight. That's causing that root zone temperature to go up. So grow bags are much better that way. This one is up in the air, but generally you have fewer blowovers with grow bags. Now you're using them above ground, and we talked out at the nursery. You do get some blowovers. You've got the cable system there. I would make use of that as much as you can to prevent blowovers because every time a tree blows over, you risk breakage, you lose fertilizer, you lose soil. There are lots of reasons why you want to prevent blowovers of these trees. And then they're easy to move around. Most grow bags come with handles on them. You can pick them up, 2 people, 1 on each side, and move them relatively easy. When it comes to putting them away for the winter, that helps you there, cuts down on the labor needed, and just easier to move from place to place. To take out to a planting site, it's going to be easier. All of those features make grow bags probably more beneficial than plastic containers.
Dan, have you seen anybody hit on any ingenious idea about how to make it easier to get the root system out of the grow bags? I'm constantly thinking about that, but I haven't come up with anything other than maybe putting some shims in. So when you pull the shims out when you go to plant, maybe that would provide a little more wiggle room to get it out. But I was wondering if you know of anybody who's doing anything with that.
Well, I must say that most people who are using these grow bags, first of all, are growing them in the ground somehow. So they get actually more rooting out than you do. And most people are cutting the grow bag off and not reusing it. You're in a slightly different situation where you're trying to reuse them to cut down on costs. I don't know that the shim idea would work. You would almost have to put a shim on every square inch of diameter around the inside of the container to prevent roots from going through. And roots are crafty little things. They'll work around your shims and find their way out and into the grow bag fabric somehow. So I don't know if that would work. Other than that, I don't know of a good way. They used to make containers, plastic containers with copper on the inside of them. And when the roots hit the copper, they would stop growing because the copper is a toxic thing to the root system. I don't think they're doing those anymore, probably because the copper was toxic to the people handling the pots as well. But that was a good way to stop roots from going up against the container and circling so much. But other than that, I don't know a good way to stop that. Anybody else on grow bags?
I don't know much about tree growing, but I know that with lots of other plants, there's concerns about I can't think of the term now, but like with the roots filling up the bag or the pot entirely and that creating issues down the line for the growth of the plant. Is that an issue with trees, or do you like want them to take up as much space as they can? Does it stunt their growth once you put them in the ground, or can it help prepare them for a space that doesn't have a lot of room to grow, like maybe a mow strip or something?
So this is kind of a double-edged sword. You obviously want as much root system as you can get on anything you're planting. But there are limits to that. If you keep things in the nursery too long, let's say an oak stays in the nursery for 7 years, you're going to end up with girdling roots. And that becomes a problem when you go to plant them. You need to cut those girdling roots before you plant them. Otherwise, that girdling will continue after it's planted, and that becomes a real problem down the road for the tree because it will actually choke the tree off. But grow bags are better than plastic containers for that, in that the roots can go through the fabric and then they get air pruned, and then new roots grow and maybe punch out through the fabric somewhere else and continue to grow. But again, that's all going back to how long you want to keep things in the nursery. If you're keeping them much longer than 3 or 4 years, you're going to run into girdling root issues and have to deal with that when you go to plant them. So cutting down on the time in the nursery is going to be beneficial on the back end as far as labor that's involved in planting the trees.
About the girdling roots, are those the coarse roots that are okay to cut, or are they the finer roots?
Well, again, time served in the container is going to dictate that. Certainly, fibrous roots can become coarse roots as they grow, but it's generally the coarse roots that are going to be girdling when you take them out of a container. And I don't know that there's too many plants we sell down at Sugarloaf that I don't recommend cutting the roots on. Be it a tree or a shrub, I recommend, I use my little pocket knife as an example. I will cut the roots on almost everything, depending on the nursery they come from also. Some nurseries are better than others at transplanting, but cutting the roots when you go to plant, taking a pocket knife and going in 3 or 4 spots, cutting through 2 or 3 inches deep if you can. If the roots are larger, like on a shade or flowering tree, you may have to use pruners and actually cut those coarse roots. But we definitely want to make sure there are no girdling roots when we go to plant. In the case of your grow bags, it might require washing all the soil off before you plant to see if you have any girdling roots hidden inside the grow bag, which would be, again, a labor-intensive project. But it may be something that you have to do going forward. Again, depending on species and how rapidly they grow, how rapidly their root system grows, it may be something you have to deal with. That comes back to planting bare root trees. When you plant bare root trees, you can see the whole root system when you go to put it in the ground. You can cut the coarse roots if you need to. Generally, you're not going to have girdling roots on a bare root tree because they're coming up out of the soil. They've had all the room they want to grow whichever way they want, and they're not constricted by the container and causing that girdling root system.
I'm sure this is something all of you already know, but I'm familiar with the term fibrous roots. Are coarse roots like roots that provide like the structure and the sort of like, the prevent the tree from like blowing over once it's in the ground? What are the functions of the coarse roots?
So the coarse roots are your foundation. They're your stabilization. They're going to prevent the tree from blowing over. They're going to keep it from leaning side to side. They're your support system. The fibrous roots are your uptake system. They're going to take up your water. They're going to take up your nutrients. As they grow, they can become coarse roots, and fibrous roots will continue to grow. If you look at a tree, and again, maybe Mary can send around some of these lists that she's looking at that have the photos of the root systems on the trees, you can see the coarse part of the root system and the fibrous part of the root system. And as that coarse root continues to grow out into the soil, fibrous roots will grow off of that. So the support system is still there, but you're getting nutrient and water uptake even off of the coarse roots as well.
Is it ever beneficial to put mycorrhiza into the soil?
100%, and it's becoming more and more of a thing to inoculate the root system with mycorrhizae. You can do this through a dip. There are mycorrhizal dips you can do before you plant the trees, especially if you're planting bare root trees. The nursery out in New York, I believe that's part of the dip that they do before they ship them to you is mycorrhizal inoculation. And mycorrhizae are going to aid in the early uptake of nutrients and water, but they also colonize the root system, so they will stay with the tree and help with root uptake of nutrients and water even as the tree grows. And white pines are one of the best ones. As an example, they have huge mycorrhizal associations with their root systems. And if you were ever to dig up a white pine from the forest, you'd see all the white mycorrhizae around the root system there. Anybody else? So plastic containers, they are petroleum based. There's a lot of oil that goes into making plastic containers, but because they are so widely used, they are probably more cost effective than the grow bags. You can get, let's say, a 10 or 15 gallon container probably for less money than a grow bag, depending on who you deal with. They're mass produced. They come in sizes ranging from, let's say, a 8-quart or 5-pint pot all the way up to 125 gallons. Not that I would want to lift a 125 gallon pot, but they make huge containers. They grow palm trees in Florida in 125 gallon containers, and they will be 30 feet tall in those containers. Palm trees don't have much of a root system, as you might know, but they can do it in containers. They're lightweight, so handling them and moving them around is easy, just like the grow bags. They can be stacked up and stored. However, they take up a lot more room. They don't lay flat like a grow bag, so you probably could fit 200 pots in your shed out there at the nursery, and that would be about it. The rest would have to be stored outside. Then the wind plays games with them and likes to blow them around and that kind of thing. So that's a bad thing about plastic pots. They're easy to clean and reuse. So that goes back to Mary's point about the grow bags. You can reuse plastic containers. You probably want to treat them with a bleach solution before you reuse them, just in case there are any disease issues within the pot or mold growing on them. But you can reuse them. They're durable. They last forever, unfortunately. And that's a big problem in the nursery industry right now, trying to recycle these things. They are not easy to recycle for a couple different reasons. There's a lot of different resin types used in plastic pots, so they need to be sorted according to resin type, and they need to be washed very thoroughly, because all of that soil and perlite and anything else that's in the container is a contaminant when it comes to recycling, because they melt these down and turn them into something new. And then there's the collecting of the plastic containers. Monrovia Nursery down in Connecticut was doing plastic pot recycling for a while, but it just became too cost prohibitive after a certain amount of time. They would collect the pots, sort them themselves using their labor, and then they would compact them into these bundles and ship them off to a recycler in Rhode Island. And it was a great program for us at Hadley Garden Center for several years, and then they just stopped because it got too cost prohibitive. The root system of trees are easy to remove relatively from plastic containers. So again, that goes back to the grow bags. The roots don't generally grow through much of a plastic container. They can go through the holes on the bottom, and certain species will root in that way. We can have willow trees down at the nursery that we literally have to get a spade out for to cut the root system from if they sit too long. And blowover is a big problem with plastic containers. Because of the nature of the beast and how they're designed, when you get a red maple, let's say, fully leafed out in the springtime, and you get a good gust of wind, they just want to go over. And as I said, every time a tree blows over, branches break, fertilizer is lost, soil is lost, and you have the labor of going and picking them up. So there is that with plastic containers. Now, there are things you can do. You can do a cable system like you're doing to support them and attach the trees to them using suitable attachments that aren't going to cut into the bark and that kind of thing. You can also use rebar that is bent into a J shape and hammer that into the ground and over the lip of the container to hold them down. They do make these things called top hats, which again are expensive, but they are a metal form that you can set the container into. It's got a wider base than the pot, so it prevents blowovers. We might experiment with some of those at the nursery. The problem for us in a retail setting is that the top hats take up more room than the actual container. So you have to have your trees spaced out more, which takes up more of your real estate. So that's something to think about with top hats. We may look into a cable system like what you're doing in the future once we decide how our nursery is going to be fully laid out after we build a store, which is hopefully starting this July. And then we'll be able to set up a cable system, which is a more permanent setup, but probably better for us in the long run. Any questions about plastic containers? As far as alternatives are concerned, they're on the horizon. The nurseries are listening. They're hearing from their customers saying, what do we do with all these plastic containers? How do we get rid of them? The industry is getting after themselves and saying we need to do something about all this plastic waste we're creating. We're a green industry, but all this plastic is not very green. So they're starting to work on alternatives. Coconut coir is one that they're trying out. There are paper pots on the market already. They're using recycled paper and cardboard to make containers out of. They're using rice hulls to make containers out of. The problem when it comes to our end of it, the retail end of it, and the growers as well, is the durability of these containers. Unfortunately, they break down very quickly in the sun and the rain and the irrigation and tend to fall apart quite quickly. And that's a real problem for growers, but it's an even bigger problem for us, because what do we do with a broken down container when we go to put it in somebody's car? We have to come up with an alternative, whether it's dropping it into a plastic pot or putting burlap over it. It's more cost on our end. So they need to perfect this more. I know that Pride's Corner Farms down in Connecticut is going to start growing some of their smaller material, smaller perennials and vegetables and that kind of thing in recyclable or biodegradable containers starting next year. So they are listening. So there is a lot of work being done on recyclable containers going forward, and hopefully it comes on the market sooner rather than later. Any questions? Wow. That was all our topics for tonight, Mary.
Okay. Well, I do have a question going back to the planting of the bare root into the pots. Can you talk a little bit about staking once they're planted in the pots?
That was in our pruning talk, which we're going to do out at the nursery when we can figure it out. But staking is very important, especially on fast-growing species like red maples. We want to have a good leader on any shade trees that we're planting out. So staking them from the start is definitely the way to go. And you want to stake almost to the tip of the tree, almost to the very point of the leader. And if the leader grows beyond your stake, you're going to have to get a bigger stake. Using plastic twist ties or I can't remember what we called it at Hadley Garden Center, but there's tie tape that won't cut into the bark, something that won't cut into the bark to attach the stake to the tree is the way to go. And there are gadgets on the market that help you to tie or stake trees that you can buy relatively. I think it's called a tree tapener. That allows you to kind of fasten that plastic tape around the tree relatively easy. Velcro can be used as well. They do make Velcro in thin strips that you can use to stake the tree. But it's really important, again, on fast-growing trees. But I noticed even some of your oaks and things out at the nursery could benefit from staking to get that leader growing straight, so that we establish a central leader, and the tree will grow naturally straight and upward the way we want it to once it's planted out.
And so when we do that, we're not allowing the tree to develop any sort of, I don't know, structural, it's not able to move around in the wind and develop more strength, right, during that time.
I wouldn't say that. I mean, the stake is attached to the trunk and then works its way up the tree, but the tree can still move within the container. If you didn't know, a little bit of movement within the container actually helps to grow the root system and makes for a stronger root system. That's true in the ground as well. A little bit of movement. We don't want to stake it so tight that it can't move. I don't know that you have to stake any of the trees that you're planting out within the city limits here after you plant them. But larger trees, let's say 2-inch caliper trees, do require staking quite often when they're planted out in the urban setting to prevent let's say undesirables. In Amherst, we have a big problem with college students pushing trees over that are newly planted, so that's why they have to stake them down there. Who knows up here? But that's when you can run into people staking them so tight that the tree can't move. But I don't think that's going to be a problem in your grow bags out at the nursery. You're just putting one stake in. It could be bamboo. It could be plastic coated metal. It's all whatever you can afford and whatever you can come up with. Maybe you could even have Lemoore Lumber do something for you, relatively inexpensive. I know they used to build stakes for us at Stewart's Nursery when I worked there, and we would use those out on the highway to stake plants.
He's done doing that now.
Oh, really? Well, there's another guy I have that maybe could do them for you too. So,
I just want to make sure I understand. We do stake them when we plant them in the ground. Are you talking about staking as well when they're in the grow pot?
That's actually the more important time because you're talking about a young plant. You're talking about a whip that's growing rapidly. And again, we want to establish a central leader on most of our shade trees. So staking that tree so it grows straight and then establishes that central leader is actually more important. The stakes out in the planting sites throughout the city are more for stabilization and to prevent any undesirables from pushing the tree over and knocking it out of the ground.
The way that the stake is working, is it like the tree is being grown in the forest where it's more likely to be straight rather than open grown where it'll branch more? Or is it just that you have it held upright so that it's growing straight and the leader is tall and straight?
So in the forest environment, trees grow pretty much how they want to grow. The sunlight dictates how the leader grows in the forest, as it does in the nursery. But we're feeding them and watering them and trying to get them to grow faster so we can plant them out sooner. And that means the leader is growing faster. So the stake within the nursery is to create a straight tree, which is what most people want on their streetscape, and to establish that leader. In the forest, it's less of a problem. We're not looking for that because, again, they grow the way they want to grow out in the woods. And they're going to find their way to creating a straight leader. A lot of that, when you look at a forest that's been logged, the trees that are left are nice and straight because they've had neighbors around them dictating how they grow. Once you take those neighbors away, you get a lot more crooked trees growing until the forest fills in again. Any other questions? How are we doing on time over there, timekeeper? Well, thank you. We'll do this again.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate it.